Hello and welcome to the Tifo Football Podcast. I'm Joe Devine, and today I'm joined by Seb Stafford-Bloor.
Hello, Joe.
Hello. Seb and I were joined today by Michael Bailey, Norwich City football writer extraordinaire, wonderful friend of the podcast, been on once before, lovely chap, and we talked to him all about Norwich City. Now, of course, we anticipate, and I think Michael accepts too, that even though it's not mathematic yet, mathematic? That's not a word, is it? Anyway, even if it's not mathematic yet, Norwich are probably going to be relegated to the Championship. What a shame. It is actually a shame. I'm saying it like that's sarcastic, but it's not. But anyway, we tried to be optimistic on today's podcast because we love Norwich. Seb, what were we optimistic about?
We're very optimistic about Todd Cantwell. In fact, it almost became a Todd Cantwell podcast at one point. We got about sort of 10,
Wouldn't
15
mind
minutes
that.
in. Wouldn't mind that because he's a really interesting guy. But we did Todd and did a few bits on the squad's shortcomings this season, on a few of the loan anomalies which have bounced in and out of the club, and a few next steps. And we did try and be optimistic. I mean, every time you said that's a shame during the pod, it did sound sarcastic. I mean, I don't know whether that's worth an edit. You know, every time you reach for sincerity, you just don't seem to have that gear in your personality.
I don't know where it is. I'm not sure where to look. Hey, you mentioned next steps there, though, Seb. Do you know what the listeners' next steps should be?
Tell me.
To sign up to The Athletic by visiting theathletic.com/Tifo, where you can find all sorts of fantastic football articles. If you're a Norwich fan listening to this, I'm sure you're probably already aware of Michael's writing, but it really, really is very, very good. So you can get a 30-day free trial by visiting theathletic.com/Tifo to go and check out Michael's writing, or indeed any of the other dedicated club journalists. There's 10 other sports as well. One of them's MMA. Is that a sport?
Probably is, yeah.
Yeah. Hey, Seb, also one more thing. Did you know that we have a new producer?
I do know that now. It's exciting. It makes me feel a little bit more important.
Yeah, I feel quite a lot more important today as well. Adonis, is that your primary role here, to make us feel more important?
Looks like that, yeah.
Sounds like it's just to be short and snappy. I don't know. Seem to be getting off to the wrong foot here. Never mind. Anyway, we'll come back to Adonis on the next episode and hear more words from him. But for the time being, we will leave you in the cool hands and the warm embrace of Michael Bailey. Michael Bailey, I would like to start by asking you this question about the Norwich team, because I've watched this Norwich team a lot this season. I watched them a lot last season as well before they were promoted. And I think the vast majority of the players in the first 11, and also many of the squad players as well, they're excellent players. I look at them all and I think, you know, you would fit into this Premier League team, Europe Premier League quality. Am I a little hazy-eyed here? Or what's happened? Why are Norwich in the position that they are, given the quality that they have on the pitch?
Oh, what a question that is. I think, I mean, they've definitely lost their way. Now, I think you can look at that in terms of the psychology of it, because certainly if you take into account last season when they got promoted, once they got going, they didn't really have any proper major setbacks. If they lost, there were always extenuating circumstances, and nothing happened to really dent their confidence. And you're talking about Jamal Lewis, who'd only played for 6 months before that season. Max Aarons had made his debut 5 games into that season. They were fearless youngsters who were just steamrolling it. The momentum was remarkable, and also very able players who had the quality to kind of negate any psychological effects. They would create a situation where it would reinforce their belief, so it didn't really matter. That's very different at this level, and I think for Norwich, all those players have had to play at such a high level for everything to go so well to compete. The margins are quite small, and so when things haven't gone well, and I think that's why we haven't seen Norwich say equalise when they've gone behind, or if they've just missed a few chances, then that was kind of their opportunity gone, and they found it so hard to get back into games. And I think that's possibly symptomatic of that sort of psychological damage, if you like, and the sort of intensity of the level that they're playing at now. I think Daniel Farke has been very rigid and confident in how he's wanted to play. The only times where he's kind of given up more of the ball willingly and wanted his side to sit deeper, he's only really done it against the very elite sides. So if you're talking about coming up against, teams like Wolves and Crystal Palace and maybe Burnley, this is how we're playing. We're going to go straight in and go ahead of it. And I don't know if that's because they beat Manchester City and there was an element of them thinking we can really do this at this level, and it's really hard because you're talking about a sort of a compromise over philosophy at that point. But maybe too often Norwich have believed that they would be good enough to be entirely on the front foot, and then it just has come undone. And then you tie that into the fact that they haven't been able to get themselves back into games. Those two elements together are a bit of a toxic mix. They have had injuries, and I think they've been really unsettled at the back, which hasn't helped, certainly in central defence. But then ultimately it's been at the other end of the pitch and the lack of scoring goals and taking chances and an over-reliance on Teemu Pukki, because these wonderfully talented midfielders and forwards behind them, they just haven't chipped in with goals. And that's been very curious. I mean, so someone like Marco Stiepermann, who was so important last season, just has not stepped up. And to be honest, that kind of looked an issue from the first game against Liverpool on the opening night of the season. And even someone like Emi Buendia, who has created an amazing amount of chances, hasn't got a goal to himself. So it's probably a lot of players stepping up to a new level for the first time. There's so many of them are phenomenally talented, and actually so many of them, if you put them individually in a more established side, I think they would look the part. But with them all being together, and again, to be fair to Daniel as well, he has only managed a senior first team really at this kind of level for as long as he's been at Norwich. Before that, Lippstadt, but in between he was at Dortmund too. So that was playing basically 23s football in the third tier of German football. So I think an element of his own learning and dealing with the situations has had to come into it when you talk about a level like the Premier League, which is obviously the difference between this and the Championship. It gets said a lot, but that's because it's true, and all of that has kind of factored into where Norwich are, and it's been a sorry old few weeks, to be honest. Sorry.
No, I think that's true. I mean, I was just thinking about relegation, potentially relegation-bound teams at the moment. I think it's fair to say Aston Villa have at least three players you would consider, good Premier League players in Jack Grealish, and an excellent one, perhaps Tyrone Mings as well. But with Norwich, I mean, you mentioned Buendia and Stiepermann there already. Add to that, Godfrey, Lewis, Aarons, and Pukki, and a player I'd like to talk to you about now as well, Todd Cantwell. I mean, those are all players, as you say, that you feel like if they were in other Premier League teams, they'd be doing exceptionally well. In the case of Todd Cantwell, would love to get a sense of who he is as a player and as a person, because he's captured the imagination, I think, this season in the Premier League. And there is talk around whether Norwich can or keep him or not after the summer. But we'd love to get a sense from you of who he is as a person and a player.
Todd is a bit different, to be honest. I really like him. He's articulate. He's incredibly strong-willed, and I remember speaking to one of the guys on the Ball podcast about how it sort of clicked when he got to 16, and there was this drive and focus in him that they hadn't really seen before. I think all of his time at Norwich, from joining the academy at the age of 10, I think everyone thought that they had a special talent, but then so much of that is about their attitude, about how they develop, and there were constant question marks over whether Todd would be strong enough for what might be to come, which is, I suppose that comes up in a debate with so many players. But I think Norwich probably had him earmarked, and possibly at times that protected him a little bit, but he still had to kind of fight so hard through each of those stages, and his own self-belief is phenomenal. I mean, I heard one story that Norwich sold James Maddison, who was obviously a phenomenal talent in Daniel Farke's first season. Norwich sold him for a record sale for the club, and no one who watched James Maddison that year in the Championship would have had any doubts that he would go on and show what he could do in the Premier League, and that's what he's done. And Todd Cantwell wanders into Daniel Farke's office, I think, before the next season, and says, "Look, I'll fill those boots. I'm good enough. You don't need to go and replace James. I'll do that." At that point, he played, I think, extra time in a third round FA Cup replay at Chelsea, and that was it. And I think even for Daniel Farke was probably looking at that and thinking, okay, well, I completely disagree with you, Todd, but I appreciate the fact you're saying and telling me this. And it was after that, it was then the second half of that next season that Todd went to Fortuna Sittard in the Dutch second division and helped them get promoted. And even now I look back at that, the fans loved him there. He made a real impact. I think he was a big favourite. They'd have had him back in a heartbeat in the Dutch top flight. But he didn't play that many games. He only scored a hatful of goals. And you sort of look at the raw stats and you're like, well, it wasn't much to judge anything on. And I have to say, even in the Championship last year, which was a big step for Todd, there were a handful of games later on in that season where Emi Buendia was suspended for a sending off against QPR, and Daniel, who, in fairness, since Todd came back from Holland, I think Daniel's always trusted in Todd, certainly this year. But even then, and so he put him in place of Emi, and Todd did okay, but almost the fact of him being a homegrown player put a lot of pressure on him from the fans, and the fans weren't really were giving him stick for, and probably harshly so, because it was just the fact he wasn't quite at Emi's level at that point. And I find it, I have to say that from the very moment of pre-season this summer, he came in and you watched him play. I remember watching him play, especially at Atalanta, I think was the friendly. Norwich lost 4-1. They were 1-0 up in that game. And I hate pre-season, pre-season friendlies. You can't judge anything on them generally. But I looked at Todd and just thought, wow, I don't know what switched here, but you look at a different level. And it's remarkable then this season, and I think probably the most impressive thing now is that I'm watching Todd play in these weeks. Norwich look a little bit lost here and there. It's really difficult. But Todd is just continuing to grow into the surroundings, and players who looked a long way ahead of him 12 months ago, they're struggling to keep up with him at the moment. And I think, again, someone at the club told me several months ago, they said, I can't believe what Todd is doing now. But I'm now not going to predict what happens in the future because he's already surprised me. And I honestly think if you look at what he does and how he goes about things, he could probably get to any level and just keep surprising us because it's phenomenal. And so I think he's almost at a level now where you think, well, either Norwich somehow keep hold of him and can build around him next year when they get relegated, or someone's going to come in and take him away. But I think that all says so much about his own drive and personality. I think he's a likable guy. He's intelligent and he's articulate, but he also has an unnerving belief in what he can do.
Michael, can I ask about his family? You wrote a wonderful piece back in the autumn about his ascent through the academy, and he seems to come from a small army of ex-professional players. I think his grandmother used to play professionally during the years when women's football was banned. Is that right?
That is right, yes. And Todd's sister, so Todd is the youngest of three. Jordan was the eldest, and he was at Norwich's academy before Todd. A couple of years, I think he's older. I might have to remind myself there, but I think he left the academy 2 years before Todd joined. And that was one of the reasons why Todd's parents were quite wary of allowing Todd to go into the academy, because I think there were things with Jordan's progress and maybe they just were trying to work out if it was worth it or not. And because of the heartache, and I think Jordan found it very difficult when he came out of the academy. Amber's incredibly proud of what her nan did, and she too played for Norwich, went through their player development centres, and I think she's currently at Cambridge United. And I think the three of them have had lots of fun playing in the kitchen, and sounds like they all picked up some quite nasty injuries, sort of throwing each other against cupboards or what have you. But I think that's a really interesting dynamic with so many footballers in terms of how they sort of play with older siblings and things like that, in terms of their robustness almost and resilience. But it's a remarkable sort of football heritage, and I think that is the thing with Todd. There are things he does, and there are things people spotted in him when he was 8, 7 that you just can't coach. You just have this child here. I remember one of his first coaches, he was 7 or 8, and they were like, he went down, came for the first session, and you knew within an hour that he was something special. I mean, all you're doing then is kind of trying to bring it out and develop it on, I suppose, and make sure it doesn't get lost in other things. So that family heritage is obviously a big part of Todd. They're a really close family, actually. So it's not just lip service. I think because they're so tight, they know exactly where their family heritage is, and I think it does mean a lot to all of them.
I think his brother referred to them as a Norfolk footballing dynasty, which is that's very bold.
No pressure.
No pressure at all. I mean, he comes across as quite a quirky guy, and you'll have encountered him in the mixed zone this season after quite a few bad results. What's he been like personality-wise during the kind of the peaks and troughs of Norwich season? Because that's usually quite an interesting indicator.
I remember I spoke to him about how after it was New Year's Day, I think, Crystal Palace, he scored in that game really early on. Kind of the story of Norwich's season. They conceded an equaliser thanks to a marginal VAR offside call going against them with about 4 minutes to go, and it was like, I think Palace's only shot on target, so pretty dismal afternoon way to start the year. And I remember asking him in that game about how are you going to stop people getting distracted by their own futures, especially youngsters like himself, and obviously Max Aarons, Jamal Lewis, all of these guys, Emi Buendia. And his answer was really focused. And obviously, you, in my position, and you guys will know this as well, I'm sure, but you speak to someone, you kind of know when they're just rattling off what they know they need to say. There was something really genuine in how Todd was saying it, and in terms of how together they were and how they kind of knew they were all tied into each other's fate. And he is very good at putting across his thoughts, and he is really grounded. And you, that kind of almost contradicts, I always think, with his public image, because I think I made a joke about one of his Instagram tweets because it was some sort of forlorn expression on his face, and he put underneath it as the caption, JUS me, as in, you know, it's just me. And I was like, what Jew me, as in an orange? I didn't know. And it's just like there's just something a bit off kilter.
That is a deliberately old man response to that, Michael. How dare you? Yeah. People have a culture too.
That's for the kids, that one. I've got 2 kids now. You know, I am by default an old man. But
you're allowed to say things like that now. Yeah.
So there is that confliction, because he is a really grounded, homely guy, and how his career develops will be really interesting with that, because the persona that almost comes out is very different, and he is a very marketable asset. I think, you know, when it comes to the summer, I think he will be one who will attract big bids because of sort of what he is and how he goes about things as well. But the other thing about that conversation in the mix zone was I then tried to, he made a point about Teemu Pukki, and forgive me, I can't exactly remember what it was, but I think he made something about how Teemu was helping them all out, and I asked him for it to expand on it, because he, you know, don't tell me stuff like that without giving me examples, please, Todd. And he kind of rolled his eyes and went, "Oh, do I have to?" And he was looking to the press assistant, Charlotte, to just can the interview there, but she didn't. So I think I think there's a bit of him who, I think he kind of knows where he is, but he's respectful in that way, and I think he's got a lot of tools that will see him okay regardless of what he goes through.
Yeah, he only has a certain amount of time for Michael Bailey. I like that about a person. Let's talk about recruitment now, because Stewart Webber, who incidentally was on the Ornstein and Chapman podcast this week, which is totally worth a listen. Stewart Webber, rightly praised for his work. His name comes up often in conversations around sporting director vacancies at bigger clubs, and I suppose his name is known in a way that many sporting directors' names aren't. So there's something interesting to reflect on there. But he does feel a little bit as if this team was left short of what it needed for the season. And a couple of examples of that. Ibrahim Amadou was a loan deal, obviously cut short because he wanted to return to Spain. We had Dermich on a free transfer from Gladbach, but not a huge number of starts, and I think 1 goal. And Patrick Roberts, who played 20 minutes before terminating his loan and going down a division. Now, Seb wrote these notes, and Seb says to me, 1 loanee leaving early is just one of those things. It happens, but 2... You can expand on that, Michael?
Especially when I think they're pretty much your only 2. The third one was Ralph Farman. I think there were 3. So Ralph Farman, the goalkeeper, also left Norwich from a season's loan in Schalke he left in March, I think. It was literally just before
Did
the
he
suspension.
get injured, Michael? Or did he...
He did get injured earlier in the season. He did, yeah. He basically had a really good opportunity because Tim Krul was out, and then he pulled his groin. And I think he'd done his groin a week or so before, so they kind of raced him back fit. He wasn't fit. And the funny thing is, if he'd have been fit, played when Krul was injured, you just don't know how that might have gone. He could have kept a clean sheet and then kept the position for the rest of the season. But in the end, it comes to March. His wife or partner is called Norwich, not the best place to find themselves living, and he ends up going to Norway to try and play some games.
Much better, certainly.
Before
much
football
better
was and then obviously football stops. So quite an interesting season for Ralph. But that's 3 loans where you could say they didn't work, and a fair amount of money in that as well for Norwich. I think to be fair to Stewart Webber, he has already basically intimated that he owes Daniel an apology for the recruitment in the summer. So I think he's well aware that they didn't get it right. And I think when this season is done and dusted, that theme will come up a fair bit.
How much of that comes from the top, though, Michael? Because, I mean, also we've heard a lot about Norwich, either sensibly or not sensibly, depending on how you look at it, not wanting to spend a lot of money upon promotion to the Premier League. So how much of that is within his control or not?
Yeah, I think this is a philosophical debate for Norwich to deal with. And
right.
Literally, I've just come out of Daniel Farke's virtual press conference, almost having that conversation with him, because Stewart Webber has the job he has now because he has kind of built clubs without any money, or built squads without that kind of influence. I mean, Norwich and Huddersfield anyway. And I think he will have gone into last summer. And I think so the first summer where he's had to try and build a Premier League squad, and all of a sudden the players you want to recruit, everyone's asking for 10 million quid more because you're a Premier League club. Norwich don't have that money still, mainly because they use that money to pay off the training ground money that they bought, or they've got 15 million quid's worth of bonuses they've got to pay off, or whichever, blah blah blah. Still stuff to cover, and every other Premier League club probably has extra money coming in, and Norwich are not. There is no money other than what they earn from their match days and their sales and their TV revenue. So I think even he found in the summer, it's like, oh God, this is going to be really hard. So then I think you end up getting into a position where some of if I was to give my opinion on it, some of that summer recruitment probably was a bit down the list in terms of what they wanted it to be. Josip Drumic arrives because you hope he can rediscover something he had a few years ago. It's a gamble. Then he doesn't. And you're like, well, okay, not much we can do about that now. Ibrahim Amadou was a little bit down the list, I think. He was a late signing as well, which kind of backs that up. And I don't think at any point Daniel Farke was in any way convinced about him being a midfielder, which I still think was a bit of an issue. And I would have preferred to have seen something more flexible from Daniel in that regard. But it's his decision, and that went by the wayside. And to be honest, I think I have a feeling they got Patrick Roberts in, and ultimately after a few weeks they thought, we don't, because Stewart likes Patrick a lot, and I think he tried to sign him a few times before, so he'd actually managed to get him this time. But I think ultimately they probably looked at it and thought, I don't think you're going to be good enough for this level. And I think that's why we didn't actually really see him play. And that was kind of it, really, in terms of it. I mean, Sam Byram has obviously worked out as a success, and 750 grand, I think. So, it's stuff like that. But is that really going to be enough to establish you in the Premier League when effectively Norwich put most of their eggs in the squad that they'd already built, making the step up quickly to the Premier League? Ironically, they started really well, but it was when those doubts and obstacles came in that they kind of lost their way, and then it's very hard to sort of regain that.
I mean, regarding Patrick Roberts, you say that Stewart Webber liked him and potentially tried to sign him elsewhere. If within 2 weeks of him arriving at Norwich, it's apparent that he can't play at this level, is that not due diligence that should be done beforehand? Should we expect a sporting director to know that, or am I being unfair?
Well, I think I wouldn't say that after 2 weeks they thought he wasn't good enough. I would guess, I think he had an outing against Crawley where it was a bit in the cup. It was, Norwich were knocked out, and I suppose that probably forms a slight opinion, because obviously playing in a competitive game is different to training. I mean, Norwich have had a lot of competition in that area. So what they would also, I imagine, say is, ultimately, if you didn't make an impact, it doesn't really matter, because there were a lot of players there who played in the Championship winning side the season before who were ahead of him, and there would have been enough competition. So I think that probably is then a different argument. Were Norwich recruiting better players than they already had to improve them, or were they trying to support and supplement what they had? Was Josip Drumic ever going to be someone who was going to suddenly usurp Teemu Pukki? I mean, would you try and do that if your strikers just scored 29 goals in the Championship the season before? So I wonder if Norwich got a little bit caught in maybe trying to build the squad, but not give the improvement in quality possibly that they could. Maybe apart from Ibrahim Amadou, because I think a better, more athletic Shield of the back four was kind of the position I always wanted to see them improve in, that and a bit of extra pace up top.
Michael, can I just ask you, you've just touched on it there, but knowing what you do now and having seen what you have over the last 8 or 9 months, if you were to go back to August, how would you re-equip this squad? I'm going to ask you to speculate in more detail than a bit more pace up front. I'm going to make it more difficult for you.
That is really fundamental. That's such a fundamental question, because Norwich probably had about 30 million quid to spend, I guess. So what do you do with that when you, maybe not even that, because some of that would have probably gone on the contract extensions.
Yeah.
So I think Norwich only have one player without an out pace in their forward line, which is an El Hernandez. That was an issue for me last year. So they definitely needed that. And I know they tried to sign Alexis Claude Maurice at the end of the window in the summer. So that told me they were trying quite hard. Whether that was their first choice or a bit down the line, I don't know. But I think they were looking for that. And the fact they then didn't get that in the summer and then were kind of in a worse position come January, they probably thought better of spending the money, to be brutally honest. So I think that sort of player with more pace to get in behind and to mix up the dynamic from the intricate passing triangles and around the corners and the edge of the box and playing quite narrow, I think, because as we've seen, they haven't really been able to use the fullbacks in the same way that they obviously couldn't in the Championship. So I think that, and obviously Ibrahim Amadou wasn't the player that Daniel Farke necessarily trusted in and wanted, but that was exactly the player they needed. Someone with greater energy and real sense of defensive responsibility, because I think that happened too often in the Championship as well. Daniel loves having ball playing, sort of holding slightly deeper number sixes that use the ball really well, because obviously if you've got the ball all the time, the opposition can't score. But as soon as they went up, Daniel was aware that they were probably having to give away 45 minutes every match without the ball regardless. And at that point, if you've got someone who's as neat on the ball as Tom Treibel trying to cover defensive spaces that is not really that as natural and he's not as sharp at picking and sensing that danger, then you're in trouble. And I think it was probably the right idea of what they needed, but not necessarily the right one, because Daniel didn't trust them. I think ultimately Norwich have basically had 3 centre-backs fit for about 3 weeks all season. That is a major issue, regardless of what you say. And on
that note as well, can I ask you about Emi Buendia? Because when I watch Norwich, I always feel like he's wasted on the wing. I don't understand why he doesn't play behind Pukki more often. Is that because they want more solidity in the midfield?
Yeah, I almost asked him about it in a press conference, because you mentioned that to me, Joe. And there was a bit ahead of was it the Everton game? No, I think it might have been the Manchester United game, where I wondered if Emi was going to be playing off Teemu, because those two, him and Pukki, have such a good connection in terms of that being one of Norwich's primary supply lines. I think Daniel generally plays a 4-2-3-1 or sort of variants of that, and he mentioned this as an answer actually to where Todd's best position is. I think he prefers the freedom that a kind of number 10 has if they start slightly wider. Now, whether Emi having that defensive responsibility helps him out, I don't know, because it ends up picking up holes, and you end up picking up holes in what he's doing. He's not as high up the pitch, and he himself can be... he's very passionate, but he can get a little bit lost in himself sometimes. And I just wonder if he didn't have as much of that to worry about it might sort of free up his mind a bit more going forward.
Well, also, like, he'd be between the posts, like he'd be in the position where he could affect the most potential damage. And I don't know, it seems such an odd thing to me. I guess if they're trying for more solidity in the middle, if they want the 10 to drop back and make a midfield 3 and ground players out in that area, it sort of makes sense. But another way of looking at it is as you're describing it, Michael, like the players on, well, theoretically the wing actually have more of a defensive duty than the 10 does. So it's just always struck me as odd. And did you ask him in the end, or is that a scary question to ask Daniel Farke? Why don't you do this better?
No, I've spent 3 years doing it, even when they were going well.
Yeah.
I think what I did is I thought about it, and I think in the Championship he did still play quite central. It's kind of probably what. If I was to channel Daniel, he will talk a lot about that being Emi's position because it's their base formation in terms of when they haven't got the ball. The reality is when they have the ball, he does spend a lot of time central. He really does. So it's almost irrelevant because they're very fluid. And I think in the Championship, he could spend a lot of time there and then affect the game. What I'm watching him now, and it was the case against Arsenal, there were 3 or 4 times where he drifts inside central areas and the ball would bobble off his shin or he'd lose it, and so that's maybe a result of him still being quite young and the environment he's playing at, and again probably back to the very start of this conversation, why if you plucked Emi Buendia and put him out in a side that was doing okay in the Premier League, I think he would absolutely flourish, which is sad. But I do think he's at an interesting point, Emi, now, because obviously his future will be interesting, like a lot of them. But the momentum stopped. Norwich have picked him up and really helped him flourish to a level where I think Norwich put faith in him when others weren't really sure. So Emi's probably subconsciously got a decision to make in terms of how he pushes himself on now, or whether it's just not gone very well and how he reacts to that. It'd be interesting.
Yeah. Hey, listen, as depressing as it is, it seems very likely that Norwich are going to be relegated. Is that fair to say, Michael, before I ask my question?
It's when rather than if. I can't even... I haven't got an argument to that.
No, it's a real shame. But the question I suppose I want to ask is that from a financial perspective, given what we've already discussed, given the way that the club prepared for entering the Premier League, leaving it isn't going to be a particularly scary thing like it might be for other clubs who'd spent a lot of money, right? And obviously when Norwich are relegated back down to the Championship, they could expect to earn somewhere in the region of £100 million with the parachute payments and broadcasting income from this year. I mean, we're still to find out what utility payments have to be paid back with the stoppage, but there's money there to be spent. Well, what does that allow the club to do?
Yeah, I think Norwich should you could make an argument for them being the healthiest club in the Championship next year. To be honest, which is good. It's not going to get them promoted. I think financially, I've got absolutely no worries. I mean, probably the biggest issue would be if Josip Drmic is probably one of their bigger top paid players, and he's got another year left on his contract, and I'm not really sure if he's going to be ripping up any trees in the Championship based on this season, but we'd see. I think the bigger issue really is the baggage of this year. It is so hard to turn around from a losing mentality and then going into the Championship where people just try and beat you up every week. I mean, there's obviously a little bit more to it than that as well, but it's going to be so. The players Norwich relied on in the first season in the Championship, like Marco Stiepermann, Moritz Leitner, Mario Vrancic, they're not going to be the same people this time around because of what's happened in the last 12 months. So how that is managed by Daniel is going to be fascinating. They've got some fresh talent coming in. I have no doubt they'll have they'll have already done a good amount of work on who they want to come in, and I think that probably freshening up. That there may be much more change in the team than maybe some supporters are anticipating, because it won't work necessarily to rely on the ones who did it 2 years ago, and they might not want to. They might not feel that, but then that side isn't comparable to the one 2 years ago either. So, and all of the expectation will be on them as well. Norwich have to finish in the top 6 because that's kind of a mantra that the whole club is now built on as part of their model. It's all that sort of psychological stuff really, and they probably, putting it down to the usual cliches, they probably will need a fast start because the fans have that baggage as well, and they're all the difficult things about when you get relegated. But in terms of the peripheral stuff, it's probably as good as you're going to get.
What are your expectations for, I mean, I know we're jumping ahead almost a year, but what are your expectations for next season? Do you see Norwich as a team, if they can keep that squad mostly intact, that can bounce straight back up, or do you think there's more of a consolidation period?
No, I think the current environment and the fact that they do have a really solid base, if Daniel can manage the situation well, they should definitely finish in at least the top 6 next year. If this is closer to where Stuart Webber is used to in terms of recruiting for his for a squad, then they should be able to unearth a couple more players who can really kick on and are hungry, and then that sort of rejuvenates the squad itself. So I think they'll get the business right, I hope. Who they sell, how much for, that's going to be interesting, because we don't really know what the environment's going to be like. And although Norwich don't have to sell, I think they will look to that to help rejuvenate some of the squad. So, yeah, as far as I'm concerned, and the fans would certainly expect it, and they should really be capable of it. It will be a fresh situation, because the expectation will 100% be on them. But likewise, and I think it will be interesting who goes down with them, because I've always found that an interesting barometer. You know, if you're going down with some really strong clubs who are in a position to just kick back on, like say the two seasons Newcastle have gone down, you generally look at them and go, you know, it's going to take a lot for you not to bounce straight back up. And that might be quite interesting with whoever does go down with Norwich, and what kind of state they're in too. Because to be honest, the 3 teams that get relegated, they generally should be the top 3 favourites to go up, because the playing field isn't level.
Michael, can we step back about a year? One of the things that came up in my in my research fascinated me. What are Canary Bonds, or what were they?
Yeah, really interesting this. So Norwich hadn't really done anything to their training ground since it opened in 1997, I think it was, or might have been early 2000s, certainly a long time. All they'd really done is had loads of porta cabins and mobile classrooms and what have you, and as things grew, bearing in mind EPPP, and the club's got a Category 1 academy. So, and Stuart Webber said that they kind of urinated up the wall all their money from the Premier League before that, because they'd spent quite a few years in the top flight, obviously, and a lot of money. So one of the first things Stuart Webber came in, even though they had to turn over the squad, make up a shortfall of 40 million quid, him and the exec committee at the club, who were sort of getting their teeth into running it, were adamant that they had to do something to improve the training ground so that they could attract better players than they were. So just to update the club, because the facilities weren't what they should have been. So one of the ways they came up of doing that was a kind of a crowdfunder. It was an investment more than anything, opportunity really, open to supporters but also open to investors. They ran that through a company called Tifo, who helped Stevenage build one of the stands of their stadium, actually. And what they did is they launched it. They wanted to use the money to build an academy building in its own right. Then they could get rid of the mobile classrooms, give the academy their own building, and then improve what the first team had themselves, redevelop the pitches as well. Some of that work I think they were already going to have to do, because they've got 6 pitches at Colney, and I think the back 2 basically head straight down a hill. So they wanted to level all that sort of stuff up. And you know, Norwich are a self-funding club, so no director is going to put any money in. If they need money to do some stuff, they've got to either sell a player or generate it somehow. So they came up with this idea. They needed to raise 2 million quid from it as a minimum to make it happen through investors and supporters. I think they could invest a minimum of £500, so it wasn't, you know, open to everyone. But by the same token, people could put a lot in if they wanted to. If they raised 3.5 million quid, that was sort of what they'd budgeted for. That was their target. So 2 million it happens, 3.5. They'd be happy, and they set a limit at 5 million, because basically it was a loan that the club were taking out with supporters, and they could only really work out a financial plan to repay 5 million quid over 3 years. If they'd had a lot more, they'd have been basically over leveraged in terms of what they owed, and they didn't want to be in that position either. And basically they raised 5 million quid before it opened up to the general public. So they raised 5 million quid before just through
So
people
cool.
registering their interests. And in fact, Delia, I interviewed Delia right at the start of the season. It was my first piece for The Athletic. And she said that they wanted to invest in it and they were actually too late because it was already oversubscribed. And that's the majority shareholder. And it was, I think, a 5% interest rate back on the investment over 3 years, after which you'd get your money back. It was an unsecured investment. So the idea, I don't know if every club could do this, because essentially you're backing the club to still be in business in 3 years' time, because if they're not, you don't get your money back. There's no guarantee on getting it back. So there's a degree of faith in that. And again, that's why the club limited it. And so the preferential rate in terms of investment, it was a really good way. I'd be surprised if it doesn't pop up more often, although again, with the uncertainty maybe of club finances, it might prove a little bit trickier elsewhere. But the first thing Norwich did when they got promoted, because there was a 25% promotion bonus as well, which I don't think they were anticipating paying when they took it out. So everyone got 25% of their investment back. So that was a big chunk that came out of their first TV revenue check, I can tell you that. But they also just paid it all back as soon as they went up, because clearly they didn't want the debt. Once they had the facility to pay it back, it was their prerogative to do it. So 5 million quid went straight back and they paid everyone back, and it's like, thank you, and maybe we'll do it again, because I think Norwich are eyeing up possibly redeveloping the Jeffrey Watling stand, which is the smallest stand at Carrow Road, and they're trying to figure out how to do that, because they've basically sold out Carrow Road to 27,000 for years, probably about 20 years. So whether they revisit it in the future, I don't know. But as a success, you struggle to think of anything better in terms of a crowdfunding scheme.
In a more figurative sense, Michael, you've mentioned that this is a Category 1 academy. What's in it? I mean, or who is in it, more to the point, that people in the footballing community should be aware of? Is there any is there another Todd Cantwell lurking somewhere within the...
That's a good question, actually, because I think with Todd, there's his journey was obviously long. He'd been at the club since 10, and he's now 22. And I think there's been a lot of change at the academy over the last 4 years, and certainly Stewart Webber has tried to make the progression from the academy into the first team a real facet of what the club does, and that gap had always been quite difficult, but probably not surprising, because they were in the Premier League for quite a bit of that time. I think if you'd have spoken to someone about Max Aarons 3 years ago, I don't think anyone would have flagged him up as being this great prospect. Possibly not even Jamal Lewis, just promising youngsters in a way. So, and also a lot of Norwich's under 23s and under 18 sides now, it has changed. They've recruited players from other academies who have dropped out, and they're now playing probably more than the ones who've been there a long time through a long journey and really flourished. So I think
quite a few taken from Luton's academy, haven't there? In the past?
Exactly. Both Max and Jamal were Luton players until they were 16. Ben Godfrey wasn't really an academy signing because he was at York City until he was 18. Obviously, James Maddison was nowhere near the academy. I think some people sometimes think that was the case. So at the moment, say at Arsenal, they had Josh Martin and Jordan Thomas, two youngsters on the bench. They've both been recruited. In fact, Josh Martin was at Arsenal until about 15 months ago. So there is a different take on that, and that will be interesting over the next year or two, because some of those players will have been here enough of a time to start judging whether it's been working, compared to, say, Josh and Jacob Murphy, who were both at the club from the age of 8, I think, and came all the way through. And obviously the FA Youth Cup winners of 2013, a lot of those have been at the club a fair amount of time. So it does feel like a different dynamic. A lot of the bigger prospects have probably been out on loan this year. So Isaac Thordvaldsen, Icelandic Youth International, he's quite highly thought of, and he hasn't played a lot, but I think he's impressed, given he's still pretty young. He's impressed at Fleetwood. He's been on loan there second half of this season. He'll be in the playoffs right now. So I think he's one that I'm going to be interested to watch, because I kind of not realised how young he was. He's quite big and looks quite mature and confident on a pitch. Tony Springett, quite down the way. I think there's a lot of hope for him, but I mean, you're talking about a 16-year-old and a lot of years still to develop there. But I think Josh Martin is the one who's probably closest to breaking into the side next year. And then it's interesting because you've got, two of Norwich's January recruits, or three of them two January recruits and a third who signed on a pre-contract and has joined from July. Sam McCullum, Danel Sinani, who's a Luxembourg international, and Melvin City, he's a 19-year-old midfielder who's at Sochaux in Ligue 2. And as I said, Sam McCullum's 19-year-old left wing back who got promoted with Coventry. I mean, these are three young guys, a decent amount of money for Norwich, but probably most people wouldn't blink an eye. And they're almost the way that Norwich are developing. They're trying to pick these younger players before anyone sort of gets there first, maybe buys them a window before other teams would, to then hopefully develop them on. And sometimes it feels like Norwich's academy is actually developing players for elsewhere. It does feel a bit like that. And then if they catch one or two, they will then end up in the Norwich squad. So I think how that dynamic changes over the coming years will be really interesting, because I don't necessarily see them following the success of having Jamal, Todd and Max all coming through at the same time. I think they're doing things slightly differently, and I think that's probably how it will play out.
Hey, Tony Springett, that is a fantastic name.
Can't fail with a name like that.
You definitely can't, no. Hey, Michael, we've taken up loads of your time, but thank you so much. And I would also like to say that unlike Mrs. Farman, I think Norwich is one of the best places in the world. So I don't know what she's talking about.
Well, those who've been there, those who've been to the fine city know it, don't they, Joe?
Yeah. It stays in your heart. It really does. Thanks so much for your time, and good luck to Norwich in the Championship, and also good luck to you on a new circuit of stadiums next year, provided that you're allowed to travel.
The more things change, the more they stay the same. Thanks, guys. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Michael.